My name is Walter Kane, and at 82 years old, I never thought I'd have to swallow humiliation served up by my own son like medicine at breakfast. But there I stood last Tuesday evening, in Blake's sprawling Boise foothills mansion, watching him hold court at his 45th birthday party, when he decided to share our family business with a room full of strangers. "You know, folks," Blake announced, raising his crystal tumbler of 20-year-old scotch, "I give my old man here 4,000 a month, just like an allowance. Same as when he used to give me lunch money. Except now the roles are reversed." The laughter that followed hit me like a slap across the face, but I kept my smile steady as granite. 40 years of dealing with teenagers at Boise High had taught me something about maintaining dignity when someone tries to strip it away. I stood there in my best Sunday suit, the same navy blue one I'd worn to retirement dinners and community service awards, and nodded along like a good sport. But inside, something was crystallizing, the way water turns to ice when the temperature drops just enough. Blake had inherited his mother's sharp wit, but somewhere along the way he'd forgotten her gentle heart. The $4,000 Blake mentioned wasn't charity, though that's how he liked to frame it. When Margaret died 12 years ago, I'd made the mistake of mentioning that the Social Security and my principal's pension didn't quite cover the property taxes on our old place. Blake swooped in with his solution, monthly payments that came with monthly reminders of my dependence. What he didn't mention to his guests was how I'd worked 2 jobs for 6 years to put him through Stanford, selling my vintage Chevy and taking out a second mortgage to fund his first tech venture when the banks wouldn't touch him. I excused myself from the party and walked out to Blake's manicured garden, where the sprinkler system probably costs more than most folks in Boise make in a year. The city lights stretched out below, twinkling like stars, and I thought about Margaret. She used to say Blake had the makings of a fine man, but needed careful tending. "We're raising a prince," she'd written in her journal, "but princes can forget they serve a kingdom, not themselves." Standing there in the cool September air, I remembered the Walter Kane who'd once commanded respect in the hallways of Boise High. For 38 years, I'd shaped young minds, mediated family disputes, and earned a reputation as someone who could solve problems others couldn't touch. The same man who turned around 3 failing school programs and served on every important committee in Ada County. Somehow, I'd let Blake reduce me to his dependent elderly father, grateful for scraps from his table. I'd built my life on the principle that respect is earned through service and maintained through character. I'd served on the Boise School Board, coached Little League for 2 decades, and helped establish the scholarship fund at Boise State that had put 17 underprivileged kids through college. But none of that seemed to matter when Blake introduced me to his friends as his charity case. The drive home to my place on Warm Springs Road gave me time to think. My old Ford pickup truck might not impress Blake's Silicon Valley friends, but it was paid for, same as everything else I owned. That's something Blake never understood about his old man. I'd never been comfortable with debt, never trusted what I couldn't control. Back in my study, surrounded by 4 decades of teaching awards and community service plaques, I pulled out the metal filing cabinet I'd maintained since 1965. Organization had always been my strength. Margaret used to joke that I filed everything except our grocery lists. My fingers found the folder I was looking for, property documents. Camp Redwood. The deed, yellowed but still legal, showed the purchase date, June 15th, 1972. 34 acres of prime Idaho timberland, purchased the year Blake turned 7. I'd bought it from the state when they were liquidating old WPA camp properties, intending it as a family retreat. Margaret and I had dreams of fixing up the old cabins, maybe hosting family reunions. After she died, I'd let it sit, paying the minimal taxes each year, but never quite finding the energy to deal with it. Blake knew about the property, of course. He'd spent summers there as a boy before video games and computer camps took over his interests. But I don't think he realized what 34 acres of undeveloped land in the Boise foothills might be worth in today's market. I'd had it appraised quietly last spring, just for my own curiosity, $2.3 million with development potential that could triple that figure. I set the deed on my desk and looked at my reflection in the dark window. The Walter Kane, staring back, had been taking Blake's condescension for 3 years now, Ever since Margaret's medical bills had strained my finances, I'd accepted his help because I thought it came from love, not from some twisted need to remind me of my place in his success story. The monthly allowance had become Blake's favorite topic at family gatherings. He'd mention it to his sister Ellie when she visited from Oregon, and to his brother Paul when they'd meet for coffee in town, always with that same patronizing tone, as if my 40 years of public service meant nothing compared to his tech fortune. But sitting there in my study, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, I realized something important. I wasn't actually dependent on anyone. I'd simply been too polite, too concerned with family harmony, to assert what was rightfully mine. Blake's monthly payments weren't keeping me afloat. They were buying him the right to treat me like his pensioner. I opened my address book to the H section and found Harold Trenton's number. Harold had been practicing law in Boise for 43 years, and we'd served together on the United Way board. More importantly, Harold understood that respect isn't something you can buy or sell. It's something you command through your actions. Tomorrow, I decided, looking at that deed one more time, Blake was going to learn that his old man still had a few lessons left to teach. My name is Walter Kane, and at 82 years old, I never thought I'd have to swallow humiliation served up by my own son like medicine at breakfast. But there I stood last Tuesday evening in Blake's sprawling Boise foothills mansion, watching him hold court at his 45th birthday party, when he decided to share our family business with a room full of strangers. "You know, folks," Blake announced, raising his crystal tumbler of 20-year-old scotch, "I give my old man here $4,000 a month, just like an allowance. Same as when he used to give me lunch money, except now the roles are reversed." The laughter that followed hit me like a slap across the face, but I kept my smile steady as granite. 40 years of dealing with teenagers at Boise High had taught me something about maintaining dignity when someone tries to strip it away. I stood there in my best Sunday suit, the same navy blue one I'd worn to retirement dinners and community service awards, and nodded along like a good sport. But inside, something was crystallizing. The way water turns to ice when the temperature drops just enough. Blake had inherited his mother's sharp wit, but somewhere along the way he'd forgotten her gentle heart. The $4,000 Blake mentioned wasn't charity, though that's how he liked to frame it. When Margaret died 12 years ago, I'd made the mistake of mentioning that the Social Security and my principal's pension didn't quite cover the property taxes on our old place. Blake swooped in with his solution: monthly payments that came with monthly reminders of my dependence. What he didn't mention to his guests was how I'd worked 2 jobs for 6 years to put him through Stanford, selling my vintage Chevy and taking out a second mortgage to fund his first tech venture when the banks wouldn't touch him. I excused myself from the party and walked out to Blake's manicured garden, where the sprinkler system probably cost more than most folks in Boise make in a year. The city lights stretched out below, twinkling like stars, and I thought about Margaret. She used to say Blake had the makings of a fine man, but needed careful tending. Standing there in the cool September air, I remembered the Walter Kane who'd once commanded respect in the hallways of Boise High. For 38 years, I'd shaped young minds, mediated family disputes, and earned a reputation as someone who could solve problems others couldn't touch. The same man who'd turned around 3 failing school programs and served on every important committee in Ada County. Somehow, I'd let Blake reduce me to his dependent elderly father, grateful for scraps from his table. I'd built my life on the principle that respect is earned through service and maintained through character. I'd served on the Boise School Board, coached Little League for 2 decades, and helped establish the scholarship fund at Boise State that had put 17 underprivileged kids through college. But none of that seemed to matter when Blake introduced me to his friends as his charity case. The drive home to my place on Warm Springs Road gave me time to think. My old Ford pickup truck might not impress Blake's Silicon Valley friends, but it was paid for, same as everything else I owned. That's something Blake never understood about his old man. I'd never been comfortable with debt, never trusted what I couldn't control. Back in my study, surrounded by 4 decades of teaching awards and community service plaques, I pulled out the metal filing cabinet I'd maintained since 1965. Organization had always been my strength. Margaret used to joke that I filed everything except our grocery lists. My fingers found the folder I was looking for: Property Documents, Camp Redwood. The deed, yellowed but still legal, showed the purchase date, June 15th, 1972. 34 acres of prime Idaho timberland, purchased the year Blake turned 7. I'd bought it from the state when they were liquidating old WPA camp properties, intending it as a family retreat. Margaret and I had dreams of fixing up the old cabins, maybe hosting family reunions. After she died, I'd let it sit, paying the minimal taxes each year, but never quite finding the energy to deal with it. Blake knew about the property, of course. He'd spent summers there as a boy before video games and computer camps took over his interests, but I don't think he realized what 34 acres of undeveloped land in the Boise foothills might be worth in today's market. I'd had it appraised quietly last spring just for my own curiosity, $2.3 million, with development potential that could triple that figure. I set the deed on my desk and looked at my reflection in the dark window. The Walter Kane staring back had been taking Blake's condescension for 3 years now, ever since Margaret's medical bills had strained my finances. I'd accepted his help because I thought it came from love, not from some twisted need to remind me of my place in his success story. The monthly allowance had become Blake's favorite topic at family gatherings. He'd mention it to his sister Ellie when she visited from Oregon, and to his brother Paul when they'd meet for coffee in town, always with that same patronizing tone, as if my 40 years of public service meant nothing compared to his tech fortune. But sitting there in my study, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, I realized something important. I wasn't actually dependent on anyone. I'd simply been too polite, too concerned with family harmony, to assert what was rightfully mine. Blake's monthly payments weren't keeping me afloat. They were buying him the right to treat me like his pensioner. I opened my address book to the H section and found Harold Trenton's number. Harold had been practicing law in Boise for 43 years, and we'd served together on the United Way board. More importantly, Harold understood that respect isn't something you can buy or sell. It's something you command through your actions. Tomorrow, I decided, looking at that deed one more time, Blake was going to learn that his old man still had a few lessons left to teach. Tomorrow, I decided, looking at that deed one more time, Blake was going to learn that his old man still had a few lessons left to teach. That evening, after Jonah and Nina had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, working on the third book my publisher had requested. This one would be different. Not a memoir this time, but a guide. The Art of Late Life Revolution. A handbook for women who refuse to disappear. But first, I had a letter to write. A letter to every woman who had ever funded her own invisibility, who had ever measured her worth by how useful she could be to other people, who had ever forgotten that she deserved a place at her own table. Dear fellow revolutionary, I began, by the time you read this, you've probably spent decades making everyone else comfortable while you disappeared into the background of your own life. You've probably been told that selflessness is a virtue, and that wanting recognition for your contributions is unseemly. I'm here to tell you that being useful and being valued are not the same thing, that being needed and being treasured are entirely different experiences, and that you have spent your whole life being invited to tables where you were expected to serve but never allowed to feast. It's time to set your own table, not because anyone has given you permission, but because you finally understand that you never needed permission in the first place. You were never really uninvited to your own life. You just needed better company to share it with. The table is set, the chair is waiting, and the feast. The feast has been ready for you all along. I signed it simply, Mabel Gardner, age 84, finally seated at the head of her own table. Outside my kitchen window, the garden was blooming with camellias and azaleas, with roses and hydrangeas, with all the beautiful things that grow strong when they're planted deep and reach toward the light. At 84, I was finally blooming too, not despite my age, but because of everything that age had taught me about resilience, about dignity, about the radical power of refusing to disappear. I had found my place at every table that mattered, starting with my own. And the view from here? It was absolutely beautiful. The next morning brought one of those crisp October days that remind you why people choose to live in Idaho. I sat on my back porch with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the Boise foothills gold, and let myself remember the years when Blake's success felt like a shared victory instead of a daily reminder of my supposed failures. 1985 was the year everything changed for our family. Blake was 20, home from Stanford for Christmas break, with his head full of ideas about something called personal computers. He'd drawn up a business plan on our kitchen table, using Margaret's good china as paperweights to hold down his blueprints and financial projections. The boy was brilliant. I'll give him that. Even then, he could see possibilities that escaped the rest of us ordinary folks. What Blake's birthday party guests didn't hear was how that first company got funded. The banks took one look at a 20-year-old college kid asking for $50,000 and laughed him out of their offices. But his old man believed in him. I took out a second mortgage on this house, the same house Margaret and I had scrimped to buy in 1968, and handed Blake a check that represented everything we'd saved for our retirement. I'd been working 2 jobs then, my principal position at Boise High and weekend shifts managing inventory at Morrison Knudson's warehouse. 60-hour weeks for 3 years, all so Blake could chase his dream without worrying about money. Margaret supported the decision, even though it meant delaying her own plans for the garden she'd always wanted, and the trip to Ireland she'd been saving for since we married. Blake's first company, Tech Solutions, specialized in database management software for small businesses. Nothing revolutionary, but solid work that filled a real need. The company sold in 1991 for $2.8 million, launching Blake toward the fortune he enjoys today. The second mortgage I'd taken to fund his dream, never repaid, never even acknowledged after that first success. I pulled out Margaret's journal from the drawer where I'd kept it since her passing. Her neat handwriting, faded now but still legible, captured those years better than my memory ever could. Walter worked himself to exhaustion this week. She'd written in March 1987. Blake called from school, excited about some new project, completely unaware that his father is sacrificing his health to keep the dream alive. I worry we're raising a prince who might forget his crown, comes with responsibilities to his kingdom. Margaret had seen it even then, the way success was changing our son. Blake's visits home became less frequent after graduation, and when he did come around, he spent more time on phone calls with investors than talking with his family. The boy who used to help me fix the fence behind our house was transforming into someone who hired people to handle life's inconveniences. The doorbell interrupted my morning reflection. Through the peephole, I saw Cassandra, Blake's wife of 8 years, standing on my porch with what I'd learned to recognize as her concerned daughter-in-law expression. She'd taken to calling me Dad shortly after marrying Blake, but the word always carried an undertone that suggested I should be grateful for her attention. "Morning, Dad," she said, settling herself into Margaret's favorite chair without waiting for an invitation. "Blake sent me to check on you. He's worried you might have taken his little joke the wrong way last night." She examined her manicured nails with the same attention a jeweler gives to precious stones. "You know how he gets at parties, always trying to entertain his guests." I poured her coffee from Margaret's good china service, the same set Blake had used as paperweights for his business plans 35 years ago. "Wasn't offended," I told her, which was technically true. I'd moved past offense into something more useful. Clarity. Cassandra relaxed visibly, probably thinking her mission was accomplished. "Oh, good." Blake was concerned you might misunderstand. "He's so proud of being able to help you out, you know. Not every son would be so generous with an aging parent." The way she said aging parent made it sound like a burden Blake had nobly shouldered. We talked for another 20 minutes about safe subjects, the weather, local news, her yoga classes. But I found myself studying Cassandra with new eyes, seeing past the perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive clothes to something harder underneath. This was a woman who'd married into money and intended to protect her investment. Any threat to Blake's financial security would be a threat to her lifestyle. After she left, I called Paul at his garage on State Street. My youngest son had inherited my practical nature and his mother's common sense, but not Blake's ambition or ruthlessness. At 38, Paul owned Kane's Auto Repair, a small business that served working families who couldn't afford dealership prices. He lived modestly, treated his employees fairly, and had never once made me feel like a burden. "Blake's been talking again," Paul said without preamble when he heard my voice. Ellie called this morning steaming mad about something he said at the party last night. What'd he do now, Dad? I told Paul about Blake's allowance speech and heard the familiar sigh of disappointment that had become too common when we discussed his older brother. I keep hoping he'll remember where he came from, Paul said. But success has a way of rewriting people's memories. Paul was right about memory being selective. Blake had somehow forgotten the Christmas mornings when there wasn't much money for presents, but plenty of love to go around. He'd forgotten the summer evenings when I'd taught him to throw a curveball in our backyard, using a strike zone chalked on the garage door. Most importantly, he'd forgotten that respect flows both ways, regardless of bank account balances. That afternoon, I drove out to the cemetery, where Margaret rested beneath a simple granite headstone. I'd chosen the inscription carefully, "Beloved wife and mother, she raised men of character." Sitting on the bench I'd installed beside her grave, I told her about Blake's party and the decision I was wrestling with. "He's forgotten what you taught him," I said to the headstone, feeling foolish but needing to voice the words, "about treating people with dignity, about remembering where help comes from. I've been enabling his disrespect by staying quiet, thinking family peace was worth more than family honor." The wind rustled through the oak trees Margaret had loved, and I could almost hear her voice. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to let them be cruel." She'd said those exact words to me in 1994 when we'd had to set boundaries with her sister's drinking problem. The principle applied here too. On the drive home, I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff and sprouting wings at the same time. Blake's monthly allowance wasn't help. It was a leash, and this old dog was done being led around by someone who'd forgotten that gratitude and respect aren't optional family values. I had resources Blake had forgotten about, connections he'd dismissed, and skills he'd never bothered to recognize. For 3 years I'd been playing the role of grateful dependent, but Walter Kane, the educator, the problem solver, the man who'd shaped young minds and built community programs, that man was still here, just dormant. Time to wake him up and remind my son that respect isn't something you can buy with monthly payments. It's something you earn through your actions and lose through your choices. Blake was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The phone call came at 7:30 the next morning, while I was reading the Idaho Statesman and working through my second cup of coffee. Blake's voice carried that brisk executive tone he used when he'd made a decision and expected compliance rather than discussion. "Dad, we need to talk. I'm coming over. No greeting, no inquiry about my health or plans for the day. Just the assumption that my time belonged to him whenever he chose to claim it." 20 minutes later, his silver Tesla pulled into my driveway like a spaceship landing in small-town America. Blake entered my home with the confident stride of someone accustomed to owning every room he entered. He'd brought reinforcements, Cassandra trailing behind with a folder of what looked like official documents, and Dr. Rebecca Martinez from Boise Family Medicine, who'd been my physician for the past 8 years. "Morning, Walter," Dr. Martinez said, and I caught the apologetic tone in her voice. She was a good doctor and a decent person, which meant she was probably uncomfortable with whatever Blake had orchestrated here. Blake didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dad, we've been talking, Cassandra and I, and we think it's time to consider your living situation. This house is too big for one person. The maintenance is getting beyond what you can handle, and frankly, we're worried about your safety." He gestured around my living room as if it were a condemned building instead of the home I'd maintained meticulously for 54 years. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care, using the moment to study the 3 faces arranged in my living room like an intervention committee. "My safety," I repeated. "What specific safety concerns do you have, Blake?" Cassandra opened her folder with practiced efficiency. "We've researched several excellent facilities, Dad. Sunset Manor has a wonderful reputation, and they offer different levels of care as your needs change." She spread glossy brochures across my coffee table, like a real estate agent pushing a sale. Dr. Martinez shifted uncomfortably in Margaret's old recliner. "Walter, your health is quite good for your age, but Blake asked me to discuss some preventive considerations. Falls are a major concern for people living alone, and there are benefits to having medical support readily available. I'd heard enough. Blake, Dr. Martinez, Cassandra, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not moving to a nursing home. This is my house, paid for with my labor, and I'll leave it when I choose to leave it, not before. Blake's jaw tightened the way it used to when he was a teenager, being told he couldn't have something he wanted. Dad, be reasonable. The property taxes alone are eating up a third of what I give you each month. Wouldn't it make more sense to liquidate this asset and use the equity for your care? There it was, the real agenda. Blake wasn't worried about my safety. He was worried about his monthly payments. $4,000 had seemed generous when he'd started sending it, but now it felt like a burden he wanted to eliminate. Selling my house would give him a lump sum to invest in my care while freeing him from ongoing obligations. Actually, Blake continued, warming to his topic, I've been thinking about the old camp property too. 34 acres sitting there doing nothing, accumulating tax liability. I could take that off your hands as well. Say $200,000 for the whole parcel. That would give you a nice nest egg for assisted living expenses. $200,000. For property worth more than 10 times that amount. I kept my expression neutral, but inside something cold and sharp was taking shape. Blake wasn't just dismissing my autonomy. He was trying to cheat me out of my assets while framing it as generosity. Dr. Martinez excused herself after a few more uncomfortable minutes, citing other appointments. I walked her to the door and caught her arm gently. Rebecca, did Blake pressure you into this visit? She glanced back toward the living room where Blake and Cassandra were examining my furniture like appraisers. He called yesterday very concerned about your independence. I agreed to come because I do think seniors benefit from community. But Walter, she lowered her voice. You're one of my healthiest 82-year-old patients. There's no medical reason you can't continue living independently. After she left, Blake got down to business. He'd prepared talking points like he was pitching investors, complete with financial projections and facility comparisons. Sunset Manor offered graduated care levels, recreational activities, and meal services. Mountain View Retirement Community had a golf course and spa facilities. Boise Senior Living provided transportation and medical monitoring. What none of them offered was the dignity of choosing my own path, the satisfaction of maintaining my own home, or the simple pleasure of drinking coffee on my back porch while watching the sun rise over land I'd worked to own. I'm not moving, Blake. End of discussion. His face flushed the way it had when he was 12, and someone had challenged his assumption that he deserved whatever he wanted. Dad, you're being stubborn. We're trying to help you here. No, I said quietly. You're trying to manage me. There's a difference. Blake and Cassandra exchanged one of those married couple looks that communicate volumes without words. She pulled out another set of documents from her folder. Dad, we've also been thinking about the camp property. Blake has some wonderful ideas for developing it. A corporate wellness retreat. Maybe some luxury cabins for tech executives who need to decompress. It could be a real legacy project. A legacy project. Using my land, bought with my money, to benefit Blake's business associates. The breathtaking audacity of it struck me silent for a moment. The thing is, Cassandra continued, Blake's company could really use a property like that for client entertainment. And honestly, the tax burden must be difficult for you to manage on a fixed income. Blake could take over the property, develop it appropriately, and you'd have one less financial worry. Blake nodded enthusiastically. It's win-win, Dad. You get peace of mind, I get a development project that could benefit both of us long term. They stood up from my chair, using the movement to buy time while I processed the full scope of what they were proposing. They wanted my house and my land, framing their grab as concern for my welfare. Blake had apparently decided that his elderly father was too senile to manage his own affairs, and too grateful for monthly support to resist being managed. I need to think about all this, I told them. It's a lot to consider. Blake's face brightened with premature victory. Of course. Take your time, Dad. We just want what's best for you. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Dad, I'm probably going to cut back on the monthly payments starting next year. The company's expanding, and cash flow is going to be tight for a while. Another reason why liquidating some assets might make sense. After they left, I sat in my quiet house and let the full picture crystallize. Blake wasn't offering help. He was engineering a takeover. The monthly allowance had been phase 1, establishing me as his dependent. This intervention was phase 2, positioning him as my caretaker and decision-maker. Phase 3 would be moving me into managed care while he claimed control of assets I'd spent 50 years accumulating. But Blake had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that his monthly payments were essential to my survival, which meant he'd never bothered to assess what resources I actually controlled. The camp property was just the beginning. I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder I'd been avoiding for months. Investment, portfolio, Edward Jones account. Margaret and I had lived modestly, saved carefully, and invested conservatively for 40 years. The account balance had grown steadily, even through market downturns, because we'd never touched the principal. Blake's $4,000 a month was nice, but it wasn't necessary. More importantly, Blake had revealed his timeline. He was planning to reduce or eliminate my monthly support while pressuring me to liquidate assets that would fund his business ventures. He'd turned family obligation into a business transaction, which meant I could respond with business logic instead of parental sentiment. I picked up the phone and dialed Harold Trenton's office. When his secretary put me through, I could hear the surprise in Harold's voice. We'd served on committees together for 20 years, but I'd never called him for legal advice. Harold, I need to talk to you about property law and estate planning. Also, I want to understand my options if someone is trying to manipulate me into liquidating assets under false pretenses. Walter, Harold said carefully, are you having problems with someone pressuring you financially? Yes, I replied, looking at Cassandra's brochures scattered across my coffee table. I'm having problems with my son. Harold Trenton's law office on Main Street occupied the same building where he'd practiced for 4 decades, with the kind of solid oak furniture and leather-bound law books that suggested permanence in an increasingly disposable world. I'd known Harold since 1983, when we'd both served on the committee that established Boise's first youth crisis intervention program. He was the kind of lawyer who still believed in handshake agreements and treating clients like neighbors rather than billable hours. The current appraisal Harold had commissioned showed Camp Redwood's value at $2.8 million, with development potential that could reach $8 million if properly managed. Blake's offer of $200,000 wasn't just lowball. It was insulting enough to suggest either complete ignorance or deliberate fraud. Walter, Harold said, reviewing the documents I'd brought, your son has seriously underestimated both your assets and your legal position. This camp property alone puts you in a very different financial category than he seems to realize. More interesting, Harold continued, are these receipts you've kept from Blake's early business ventures, the $50,000 mortgage you took in 1985, the additional $15,000 loan in 1987, the $8,000 you contributed for equipment purchases, all documented, none officially repaid. In today's business terms, you were an angel investor who never received equity or formal loan repayment. What are my options, Harold? I'd kept every receipt, every canceled check, every piece of correspondence related to Blake's early businesses. 40 years of teaching had ingrained the habit of meticulous record-keeping, and Margaret had supported my compulsive filing system, even when it cluttered our spare bedroom with boxes of documents. That afternoon, I began making phone calls to people Blake had forgotten, but who remembered me. Danny Rodriguez had been a struggling sophomore when I'd convinced him to join the debate team instead of dropping out. Now he was Ada County's senior civil engineer. Sarah Chen had needed extra math tutoring to graduate. She was currently serving her second term as a county judge. Michael Thompson had spent more time in my office than in class his senior year, but had channeled his argumentative nature into journalism and now edited the Boise Weekly. But Harold's real value wasn't his legal expertise. It was his understanding of how power worked in communities like Boise. Walter, you've got something more valuable than money or legal claims. You've got reputation and relationships. Blake's forgotten that success without community respect is just expensive loneliness. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in the gesture I remembered from school board meetings, when he was preparing to deliver unwelcome news to overconfident administrators. Legally, you could pursue retroactive equity claims in Blake's companies based on your early investments. Practically, you have enough documented evidence to make any attempt at financial manipulation very expensive for him. Danny Rodriguez met me at Camp Redwood on a crisp Thursday morning, bringing survey equipment and a lifetime of experience in land development. Walking the property with him, I saw possibilities I'd never considered. The old camp buildings were solid bone structure with salvageable foundations. The timber was mature and valuable. Most importantly, the property sat adjacent to state forest land, which meant development restrictions that would actually increase its value for the right kind of project. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Surprise at hearing from their old principal genuine warmth when they realized why I was calling, an immediate willingness to help when I explained my situation in careful, factual terms. I wasn't asking for favors. I was asking for professional services, paid fairly, from people who understood the difference between success and character. Mr. Kane, Danny said, standing in the clearing where the old camp dining hall had been, this property is zoned for educational and recreational use, with grandfathered permissions that would be impossible to obtain today. You could develop it as a conference center, educational retreat, or small residential community without the environmental reviews that would kill most projects. That evening, I called Paul and Ellie for a conference call that felt like planning a military operation. Both of my younger children had been watching Blake's behavior with increasing concern, but neither had known how to address it without triggering family warfare. Paul's voice carried the controlled anger I remembered from his teenage years when he'd witnessed bullying. Blake's gotten too comfortable treating people like assets to be managed. Someone needs to remind him that family relationships aren't business transactions. Dad, Ellie said from her home in Portland, Paul told me about Blake's nursing home ambush. I'd been stewing about it for 3 days. He had no right to blindside you like that. Ellie, your nursing background would be perfect for developing wellness programs. Paul, your mechanical skills and business sense would handle the practical restoration work. We'd create something meaningful that serves others instead of just generating profit. I outlined my plan carefully, emphasizing that I wasn't seeking revenge against Blake. I was reclaiming autonomy he'd tried to take from me. The camp property would be restored as an educational retreat, honoring Margaret's memory and serving the community that had supported our family for 5 decades. Both Paul and Ellie would be equal partners in the project, receiving the inheritance they deserved while contributing skills Blake had always dismissed. The next morning brought an unexpected validation of Harold's advice about the power of reputation. Dr. Martinez called to apologize for her role in Blake's intervention attempt. Walter, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realize I was manipulated into that meeting. Blake presented your situation very differently than what I observed. I wanted you to know that if anyone questions your competency or independence, you'll have my full professional support. By noon, I'd filed the necessary permits to begin restoration work at Camp Redwood. Danny Rodriguez had expedited the applications through channels Blake probably didn't know existed, leveraging relationships I'd built through decades of community service. The project would proceed as an educational facility development, preserving the property's historical character while creating something genuinely useful. That afternoon, I drove to Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility Blake had recommended. I spent 2 hours touring the grounds, talking with residents and staff, and getting a complete understanding of their services and costs. Then I sat in their lobby and wrote a detailed online review. The beauty of it was its simplicity. Blake had assumed I was powerless because I was old and financially dependent on his generosity. He'd never bothered to assess what resources I actually controlled or what relationships I'd cultivated over a lifetime of public service. Success had made him arrogant, and arrogance had made him careless. The review would be read by other families facing similar decisions, but more importantly, it would establish a public record of my competency and independence. Blake's narrative about my need for managed care would be harder to maintain when I was clearly functioning as an informed consumer making reasoned decisions. Visited this facility at my son's suggestion and found the staff professional and caring. However, families should be aware that admission often represents giving up independence rather than gaining security. For seniors who are healthy and autonomous, community-based aging in place might be preferable to institutional care, regardless of how well managed the institution might be. Choose based on actual need, not family convenience. As I drove home through the streets of Boise, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years, the satisfaction of taking action instead of accepting circumstances. Blake had taught me an important lesson about family dynamics, though not the one he'd intended. Respect isn't something you can demand or buy. It's something you command through your choices and maintain through your character. The monthly allowance had been Blake's way of keeping me grateful and manageable. But gratitude without dignity isn't really gratitude. It's just polite submission. Time to show my successful son that his old man still had a few things to teach him about respect, relationships, and the difference between earning money and building character. The lesson plan was taking shape, and class was about to begin. The cease and desist letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier service that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Blake's corporate attorneys at Morrison & Associates had crafted 2 pages of legal intimidation, demanding I halt all development activities on disputed property and threatening litigation if I continued interfering with legitimate business interests. I read the letter twice over my morning coffee, then called Harold Trenton. Harold, I just received some interesting correspondence from my son's lawyers. Apparently, my decision to restore my own property constitutes interference with his business interests. Harold's chuckle carried 40 years of experience dealing with overreaching attorneys. Walter, bring that letter downtown. I think it's time we responded with some correspondence of our own. Harold's response was a masterpiece of legal precision, wrapped in velvet-covered steel. Rather than defending my right to develop my own property, which would have implied their challenge had merit, he went on offense. The letter formally notified Blake's company of my intention to pursue retroactive equity claims based on documented early-stage investments in his ventures, with interest calculated at prevailing business rates over 35 years. The beauty of this approach, Harold explained, is that it forces Blake to defend his business practices rather than attack your property rights. Every document he produces in response becomes evidence of your legitimate investor status. But Harold's real stroke of genius was the timing. He'd coordinated with Danny Rodriguez to ensure my development permits were approved and recorded before Blake's lawyers could file any injunctions. By the time Blake realized what was happening, Camp Redwood was already under active restoration as a legitimate educational facility. The permit approval had moved through county channels with remarkable efficiency, helped by relationships I'd cultivated over decades of school board service. Sarah Chen, now serving as county judge, had expedited the review process after personally visiting the property to verify its historical significance. Michael Thompson had covered the story for the Boise Weekly, framing it as a positive development for educational tourism in Ada County. Blake's response came within 48 hours, delivered not by his lawyers but by Blake himself, appearing at my door with the controlled fury of someone unaccustomed to being outmaneuvered. He stood in my living room holding Harold's letter like evidence of personal betrayal. "Dad, what the hell is this? Retroactive equity claims? You're going after my company because I suggested you might benefit from assisted living?" I gestured for him to sit down, but he remained standing, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "Blake, I'm not going after anything that wasn't already mine. You accepted $73,000 from me between 1985 and 1990 to fund your early business ventures. Those were investments, not gifts, regardless of how you chose to classify them later. Those were family loans. You were helping your son get started." "Exactly. And now your lawyers are claiming I have no legitimate interest in property I've owned for 50 years or business ventures I helped capitalize. You can't have it both ways, Blake. Either I'm a competent individual whose investments deserve recognition, or I'm an incompetent old man whose assets should be managed by his successful son. Pick a position and stick with it. Blake sat down heavily in Margaret's old chair, and for a moment I saw the confused young man who used to bring me his problems, instead of the corporate executive who treated me like a management challenge. Dad, I never meant for things to get adversarial between us. I was genuinely worried about you living alone in this big house. No, Blake, you were worried about the expense of supporting me, and saw an opportunity to solve that problem while gaining control of assets you'd forgotten I owned. There's a difference between concern and manipulation. The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd had in years. Blake admitted that the monthly payments had started feeling burdensome, especially with his company's expansion plans. He'd convinced himself that managing my affairs would be easier than continuing indefinite financial support. The nursing home suggestion hadn't been about my welfare. It had been about his convenience. What do you want, Dad? What would it take to resolve this? I'd been thinking about that question for weeks, and the answer had clarified through my conversations with Harold, my children, and my own conscience. I want respect, Blake, not deference, not gratitude for your generosity, but simple recognition that I'm still a competent adult whose choices deserve consideration. Blake's counteroffer came 3 days later, $2 million for Camp Redwood, with the understanding that I'd use the proceeds to fund my own care without further claims on his monthly support. It was a more reasonable number, reflecting the property's actual value, but it still missed the fundamental issue. It countered through Harold with a different proposal. Blake's company could lease Camp Redwood for corporate retreats at market rates, while I retained ownership and control. The facility would be developed as a partnership, with Blake contributing capital and expertise while respecting my authority as property owner. Any events held there would honor Margaret's memory and serve educational purposes, not just executive entertainment. More importantly, I demanded 40% equity in any business venture that used Camp Redwood, retroactive recognition of my early investments in Blake's companies, and a formal apology for attempting to manipulate me into surrendering assets under false pretenses. The negotiations stretched over 2 weeks, with Blake's lawyers trying to minimize both the equity percentage and the scope of the apology. But Harold held firm, backed by documentation that clearly established my legitimate claims and Blake's questionable tactics. During this period, something interesting happened in the broader community. Michael Thompson's articles about Camp Redwood's restoration had generated unexpected interest from local educators and historians. The property's history as a WPA-era youth camp resonated with people who understood the value of preserving educational institutions. Sarah Chen had quietly organized a group of community leaders to support the project, framing it as economic development that honored Boise's educational heritage. Donations began arriving from former students, fellow teachers, and community members who remembered my years of service. The GoFundMe account Paul and Ellie had established reached $87,000 before I'd even announced it publicly. But the real pressure on Blake came from an unexpected source. His own corporate board. Several board members had read about the family dispute in the Boise Weekly and begun asking uncomfortable questions about Blake's business practices and family relationships. Tech companies are sensitive to public relations issues, and Blake's treatment of his elderly father was becoming a liability for his corporate image. The breakthrough came during a meeting at Harold's office, with Blake's lawyers present but notably subdued. Blake had realized that fighting me publicly would cost more than accommodating my demands, both financially and reputationally. Dad, Blake said, looking older than his 45 years, I'll accept your terms. 40% partnership in the retreat development, acknowledgement of your early investments, and he paused, clearly struggling with the next part, and a public apology for underestimating your competence and independence. Harold prepared the settlement documents with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that my interests were protected and Blake's obligations were clearly defined. But as I signed the papers, I realized the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the restoration of respect that Blake had tried to take from me. That evening, I called Paul and Ellie to share the news. Both were amazed at how quickly Blake had capitulated once faced with serious legal and public relations consequences. Dad, Ellie said, I'm proud of you for standing up to him. Blake needed to learn that success doesn't give you the right to disrespect the people who helped you achieve it. Paul was more direct. Maybe now Blake will remember that family relationships aren't business transactions. You can't buy respect with monthly payments, and you can't manipulate people just because you think you're smarter than they are. As I sat in my study that night, surrounded by the documents that had secured my victory, I felt something I'd almost forgotten, the satisfaction of using my skills and knowledge to solve a complex problem. For 3 years, I'd been playing the role of grateful dependent, accepting Blake's narrative about my limitations and needs. But the real Walter Kane, the educator who'd shaped young minds, the community leader who'd built lasting institutions, the problem solver who could navigate complex family and professional challenges, that man had never disappeared. He'd just been waiting for the right moment to remind everyone, including himself, what competence and dignity actually looked like. The feature article appeared in the Sunday edition of the Idaho Statesman, with a photograph of me standing beside the restored Camp Redwood sign that Paul had carved and Ellie had helped install the previous weekend. Michael Thompson had expanded his original Boise Weekly piece into a comprehensive profile titled The Educator's Legacy, Walter Kane's Quiet Revolution. I'd expected local interest, maybe a few phone calls from former colleagues and students. What I hadn't anticipated was the story's viral spread through social media, picked up by education blogs, senior advocacy groups, and eventually major news outlets looking for positive stories about aging with dignity. The article painted a picture of my 40 years in education, the community programs I'd helped establish, and my recent decision to restore Camp Redwood as an educational retreat. Thompson had interviewed dozens of former students, colleagues, and community members, creating a portrait of quiet service and lasting impact that contrasted sharply with Blake's public narrative about his grateful dependent father. More damaging to Blake was Thompson's subtle but devastating coverage of our family dynamics. Without directly criticizing my son, the article highlighted the irony of a successful tech executive whose elderly father had been quietly funding community scholarships and educational programs while living on a modest fixed income. The implication was clear. Either Blake was unaware of his father's ongoing community service, or he was aware and indifferent to it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from former students, teaching colleagues, and community members expressing support for the Camp Redwood project. The GoFundMe account Paul and Ellie had established jumped from $87,000 to $340,000 in 3 days. Local businesses offered donated materials and services. The Idaho Education Association voted to make Camp Redwood their preferred venue for leadership retreats. But the real indicator of the story's impact came from an unexpected source, Blake's corporate communications team. They'd been monitoring social media mentions of Blake's name and had watched with growing alarm as thousands of people shared the article with comments, praising the forgotten father and questioning the successful son's family values. "Mr. Kane," said Jennifer Walsh, Blake's head of public relations, during an uncomfortable phone call, "we're seeing significant negative commentary about Blake's family relationships. Some of our major clients have mentioned the article, and there are concerns about corporate culture and executive character. Would you be willing to consider a joint statement emphasizing family reconciliation?" I declined politely but firmly. "Jennifer, any statement about family relationships needs to come from Blake directly, and it needs to be authentic rather than corporate managed. Public relations won't solve problems that require personal accountability." Blake's panic became evident when Cassandra appeared at my door the next morning, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, genuine concern mixed with barely controlled desperation. "Dad, we need to talk. This newspaper story is causing serious problems for Blake's business. 3 board members have called, questioning his judgment and family values. 2 major clients have postponed contract renewals, pending cultural compatibility assessments. Blake's company is hemorrhaging reputation and potentially contracts because of this family dispute." I invited her in and poured coffee from Margaret's China service, the same ritual I'd followed for years when Blake's family visited. But this time, Cassandra wasn't playing the concerned daughter-in-law role. She was negotiating from a position of weakness, and we both knew it. What's in the folder, Cassandra? She opened it to reveal printouts of social media posts, news article comments, and what appeared to be internal corporate communications. The picture they painted was devastating. Blake's carefully cultivated image as a thoughtful tech leader was crumbling under the weight of public perception that he'd mistreated his elderly father. This is a sampling of the online response to that article. People are calling Blake ungrateful, entitled, and worse. Some are organizing boycotts of his company's products. The tech industry cares deeply about corporate culture and executive character, Dad. This could destroy everything Blake has built. I studied the documents carefully, noting the volume and consistency of the negative response. Thompson's article had tapped into something deeper than family dynamics. It had highlighted broader concerns about how success changes people, and whether wealth creates obligations to family and community. What does Blake want from me, Cassandra? He wants to make this right. A public reconciliation, joint appearances promoting Camp Redwood, maybe a family interview showing that you've resolved your differences. Blake is willing to fund the entire restoration project and establish an endowment for ongoing operations. It was a generous offer, probably worth more than $1 million when fully calculated, but it was also a business transaction, disguised as family healing. Blake would buy his way out of public embarrassment, while positioning himself as the devoted son who'd always supported his father's philanthropic interests. Cassandra Blake created this problem by treating me like a burden to be managed, rather than a parent to be respected. Money won't fix that. Public relations campaigns won't fix that. Only genuine change in how he approaches family relationships will fix that. She left 20 minutes later, clearly frustrated by my refusal to accept what she considered a reasonable solution to an embarrassing situation. But within hours, Blake himself called, sounding more subdued than I'd heard him in years. Dad, I need to ask you something directly. What would it take for you to help me repair the damage this situation has caused to my business? Blake, the damage wasn't caused by the newspaper article. It was caused by your behavior toward me over the past 3 years. The article just made that behavior visible to people who care about family values and community service. So what do you want from me? I'd been thinking about that question since Cassandra's visit, and the answer surprised me with its simplicity. I want you to understand why people are responding so strongly to this story. It's not about me, Blake. It's about them seeing their own family relationships reflected in ours. Adult children who've forgotten to respect their aging parents. Successful people who've lost touch with the values that made their success possible. Communities that don't adequately honor the people who built them. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. The longest substantive discussion Blake and I had shared in years. Gradually, I began to see signs of the young man who'd once brought me his problems, instead of assuming he had all the answers. Dad, I think I've been so focused on building my company that I forgot to maintain the relationships that matter most. The monthly allowance wasn't help. It was a way to manage my guilt about not being a better son while convincing myself I was being generous. That evening, Harold Trenton called with an interesting piece of intelligence. Walter Blake's lawyers contacted me today requesting a meeting to discuss expanded reconciliation terms. Apparently, the public response to your story has made them realize this isn't just a family dispute. It's a corporate crisis that requires serious resolution. But the most significant call came from someone I hadn't expected, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who'd been present during Blake's attempted intervention. Walter, I'd been following the story in the newspaper, and I wanted to apologize again for my role in that nursing home ambush. After reading about your community service and ongoing projects, I realized I was completely misled about your situation. Blake presented you as a declining elderly man, when you're clearly functioning at a higher level than most people half your age. By the end of the week, the GoFundMe account had reached $680,000, with donations coming from across the country. Former students had shared their own stories about my impact on their lives. Community members had contributed memories of programs I'd helped establish. The narrative had shifted completely. Instead of Blake's dependent father, I'd become a symbol of aging with purpose and dignity. The irony wasn't lost on me. Blake had spent 3 years trying to reduce me to a manageable dependent, accepting his monthly charity while staying quietly grateful. But his attempt to control my living situation had triggered a chain of events that revealed who I actually was, not just to the community but to myself. The monthly allowance that was supposed to make me grateful and compliant had instead become the catalyst for reclaiming my independence and authority. Blake's corporate success had made him arrogant, but arrogance had made him careless about the one thing tech leaders are supposed to understand: the power of networks and relationships. For 40 years, I'd been building networks in education, community service, and local government. Blake had dismissed those relationships as irrelevant to modern success. Now those same relationships were threatening everything he'd built, and his expensive lawyers couldn't negotiate with people who cared more about character than contracts. The lesson was becoming clear, both to Blake and to the thousands of people following our story. Respect isn't something you can buy, manipulate, or manage. It's something you earn through your choices and lose through your actions. Blake was about to learn that lesson in the most public way possible. The Ada County Courthouse on Jefferson Street had been the site of countless school board meetings during my career, but I'd never appeared there as a litigant until that gray November morning when Judge Sarah Chen called Canevix Kane Tech Solutions to order. The irony wasn't lost on me that Sarah, one of my former students, would be presiding over a dispute between me and my son. Blake's legal team had arrived in force, 4 attorneys from Morrison and Associates, armed with briefcases full of corporate documents and electronic devices that probably cost more than most people's cars. Harold Trenton and I occupied the plaintiff's table with considerably less fanfare, but, I suspected, considerably more preparation. Harold's strategy had been elegant in its simplicity. Rather than portraying this as a family dispute, he'd framed it as a straightforward business case, an early-stage investor seeking recognition of his legitimate equity claims and damages for attempted fraud in connection with property transactions. Your Honor, Harold began in his opening statement, Walter Kane invested $73,000 in his son's business ventures between 1985 and 1990. These investments were documented, essential to the company's success, and never formally repaid or converted to equity. Kane recently attempted to exercise normal property rights over land he's owned for 50 years. The defendant's response was to claim these investments were gifts, while simultaneously attempting to acquire Mr. Kane's property at below-market prices through manipulation and misrepresentation. Blake's lead attorney, David Morrison himself, tried to paint me as a confused elderly man, misremembering normal family financial arrangements. Your Honor, this is unfortunate evidence of how family generosity can be misinterpreted when cognitive changes affect elderly individuals' perception of past events. That was their first mistake. Harold had anticipated the cognitive competency attack and prepared accordingly. Our first witness was Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who testified that my recent medical evaluations showed cognitive function well above average for my age group. Our second witness was Danny Rodriguez, who described the technical sophistication of my property development planning. Our third was Michael Thompson, who had interviewed me extensively and found me more articulate and knowledgeable than most subjects half my age. But our devastating witness was someone Blake's team hadn't expected, Margaret's sister Ruth, now 85 and sharp as a tack, who had kept copies of letters Margaret had written during the years when I was supporting Blake's early ventures. Your Honor, Ruth testified in her clear, carrying voice. Margaret wrote to me regularly about the sacrifices Walter was making to support Blake's business dreams. She specifically mentioned that they considered it an investment in their son's future, not a gift. Margaret was worried that Blake didn't understand the magnitude of what his parents were risking to support him. Ruth read from Margaret's letters, her voice carrying across the courtroom with devastating effect. Walter took a second mortgage on our house today to give Blake the money for his equipment purchase. We're gambling our retirement security on our son's dreams, but Walter believes Blake will honor that sacrifice someday. I pray our son remembers where his startup capital came from. Blake's attorneys tried to recover with character witnesses describing his corporate philanthropy and community contributions. But Harold systematically dismantled their portrayal by introducing evidence of Blake's recent behavior: the nursing home ambush, the property acquisition attempts, the public humiliation disguised as family affection. The turning point came when Harold introduced the cease and desist letter Blake's lawyers had sent, demanding I halt development on my own property. Judge Chen read the document with visible incredulity. Mr. Morrison, your client's legal team claimed Mr. Kane had no right to develop property he's owned for 50 years because it might interfere with your client's undisclosed business interests. How do you reconcile that position with your current argument that Mr. Kane is competent to make legal and financial decisions? Morrison's response was weak and contradictory, essentially arguing that I was competent enough to be legally responsible for my actions, but incompetent enough to require Blake's management of my affairs. Judge Chen's expression suggested she found that logic as flawed as Harold and I did. Blake himself took the stand on the second day, and I watched my son struggle to explain 3 years of condescending behavior without admitting deliberate manipulation. He claimed the monthly allowance was generosity, not control. He insisted the nursing home suggestion was concern, not convenience. He maintained that his offer to buy Camp Redwood was fair market value, not attempted fraud. Harold's cross-examination was surgical. Mr. Kane, you testified that your father needed managed care for his safety. Yet when he began independently developing property you wanted to acquire, your response was legal threats rather than welfare checks. Does that seem consistent with genuine concern for his well-being? Blake had no good answer. His corporate success had made him articulate in business settings, but family court required a different kind of honesty than boardroom presentations. Judge Chen's ruling was comprehensive and unambiguous. She found that my early investments in Blake's companies constituted legitimate business relationships deserving legal recognition. She awarded partial equity claims worth $340,000 in current value, plus damages for the attempted property fraud. Most importantly, she issued a permanent injunction preventing Blake or his companies from interfering with my property rights or making any further claims about my competency without clear medical evidence. This case, Judge Chen concluded, illustrates the importance of treating family relationships with the same respect and legal precision we apply to business relationships. Success in one area of life doesn't justify unethical behavior in another. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, felt less important than what happened afterward. Blake remained in the courtroom after his attorneys left, sitting alone in the front row like a student waiting to discuss a failed exam. "Dad," he said quietly, "I need to understand something. When did I become someone who would try to cheat his own father?" It was the most honest question Blake had asked me in years, and it deserved an honest answer. "Blake, you became that person gradually, by treating success as more important than character, by surrounding yourself with people who told you what you wanted to hear, instead of what you needed to know, by forgetting that respect has to be earned continuously, not just achieved once." We talked in that empty courtroom for nearly an hour, the longest honest conversation we'd had since he was a young man asking for advice instead of assuming he had all the answers. I saw glimpses of the son Margaret and I had raised, the boy who'd once understood that family relationships required mutual respect and consideration. 3 days later, Blake called with an unusual request. "Dad, would you be willing to meet me at Camp Redwood tomorrow evening? I'd like to see what you're building there, and I think we need to have a conversation away from lawyers and courts and all the other noise." The November evening was crisp and clear when Blake arrived at Camp Redwood, driving his Tesla carefully over the gravel road Paul and his crew had graded the previous week. The old dining hall had been restored to rough functionality, with a stone fireplace that Danny Rodriguez had rebuilt using original materials and modern engineering. I'd built a fire and was waiting when Blake walked through the door, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing jeans instead of his usual executive uniform. For the first time in years, he looked like someone's son rather than someone's CEO. "This is beautiful, Dad," Blake said, looking around the restored space. "I'd forgotten how peaceful it feels up here." We sat by the fire, drinking wine and talking about Margaret, about the dreams we'd shared for this property, about the years when family relationships had been based on love rather than financial arrangements. Blake apologized for the nursing home ambush, for the property acquisition attempts, for 3 years of treating me like a management problem rather than his father. I want to fund the scholarship endowment, Blake said as the fire burned down to embers. Not for publicity, not to repair my corporate image, but because it's what Mom would have wanted and what you've earned through 40 years of service. I accepted his offer, but with conditions that preserved my authority and honored the community support the project had already received. Blake would be a major donor, not the controlling benefactor. His name could appear on the contributor list, but the facility would be named for Margaret and managed by the board Paul, Ellie, and I had established. As we sat by the dying fire, Blake asked the question I'd been hoping to hear. Dad, how do I rebuild the relationship I damaged? Not for business reasons, not for public relations, but because I miss having a father I can respect, and who can respect me. The answer was as simple as it was difficult. You start by remembering that respect is earned through actions, not purchased with money or demanded through position. You treat family relationships like the most important business partnerships you'll ever have, requiring honesty, fairness, and mutual benefit. We drove home separately that night, but for the first time in 3 years I felt like Blake and I were headed in the same direction. The legal victory had been satisfying, but the conversation by the campfire had been healing. Sometimes the most important lessons happen quietly, in restored buildings beside dying fires, between fathers and sons who've remembered why family matters more than money. The formal dedication of Camp Redwood took place on a brilliant Saturday morning in early December, with the kind of crystalline winter light that makes Idaho winters worth enduring. Nearly 300 people had gathered for the ceremony. Former students, teaching colleagues, community leaders and family members who traveled from across the Northwest to witness what local media were calling Walter Kane's greatest lesson. I stood at the podium Paul had built from reclaimed timber, looking out at faces that represented 40 years of relationships, and felt the weight of a life measured not in bank accounts, but in lives touched and communities served. Blake sat in the front row with Cassandra, Paul, and Ellie. But for once he wasn't trying to command attention, he was simply present, waiting for whatever came next. 47 years ago I began. Margaret and I bought this property with dreams of creating something lasting for our family and community. Life had different plans, as life often does. But sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in unexpected packages. This restoration happened because a community remembered the value of treating people with dignity, regardless of their age or circumstances. The crowd included people Blake had never met but who had shaped his character in ways he was just beginning to understand. Mrs. Patterson, who taught Blake piano until he decided music wasn't sufficiently challenging. Coach Morrison, who'd insisted Blake learn teamwork before individual excellence. Dr. Yamamoto, who'd convinced Blake that intelligence without humility was just educated arrogance. After the ceremony, Blake approached the podium where I was accepting congratulations from former colleagues. He waited patiently while I spoke with others, not interrupting or trying to insert himself into conversations. When we were finally alone, he said simply, "Dad, I'd like to speak with you privately when you have time." We walked to the restored dining hall, where Harold Trenton had set up a small reception for family and close friends. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, but Blake seemed focused on something more serious than celebration. "Dad, I've spent the last month thinking about our conversation by the fire, and I realize I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement of how fundamentally wrong I was about respect, family, and what success actually means." Blake's voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before, the sound of someone who'd been forced to examine uncomfortable truths about himself. "For 3 years I treated you like a dependent who should be grateful for my generosity. I never bothered to understand what resources you actually controlled, what relationships you'd built, or what contributions you were still making to this community." I listened without interrupting, recognizing that Blake needed to articulate these realizations for his own understanding as much as for my benefit. The monthly allowance wasn't help. It was control. I was buying the right to feel superior while making you feel diminished. When you started developing Camp Redwood independently, I panicked because it threatened the narrative I'd created about your dependence on me. Cassandra joined us, carrying coffee and wearing an expression I'd rarely seen from her, genuine remorse mixed with what looked like newfound respect. Dad, I need to apologize too. I participated in Blake's attempts to manipulate you, and I said things about your competence and independence that were completely wrong. She sat down across from me, meeting my eyes directly for the first time in our 8-year relationship. I grew up in a family where money solved problems and managed relationships. I didn't understand that some things, respect, dignity, family love, can't be purchased or manipulated. You taught me that lesson the hard way, and I'm grateful for it. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering 3 years of accumulated grievances and misunderstandings. Blake acknowledged that his business success had made him arrogant about other areas of life. Cassandra admitted she'd seen me as an expensive obligation rather than a family member deserving consideration. Both committed to rebuilding our relationship on more honest foundations, but I found myself holding back from complete forgiveness, not out of spite but out of realism. Blake's apology was sincere, but sincerity doesn't automatically erase the effects of years of condescending treatment. Trust, once damaged, requires time and consistent behavior to rebuild. Blake, I appreciate your apology, and I believe you mean it. But apologies don't automatically restore relationships. That requires changed behavior sustained over time. I'm willing to work toward rebuilding our relationship, but it has to be based on mutual respect, not just your guilt about past mistakes. Blake nodded, seeming to understand that genuine reconciliation would require more than words. Dad, what would help demonstrate that I've actually learned from this experience? The answer had been forming in my mind since our conversation by the fire. Blake, you could start by recognizing that your success came from a community of people who invested in your potential long before you became profitable. Your teachers, your coaches, your parents, your neighbors, all of us contributed to creating the person who could build a successful company. I gestured toward the crowd of people celebrating outside. These people didn't invest in you expecting financial returns. They invested because they believed in human potential and community responsibility. The question is whether your success has made you forget those obligations or inspired you to honor them. Blake's response surprised me with its thoughtfulness. Dad, I'd like to establish a scholarship fund, but not just as a tax write-off or public relations gesture. I want to create something that honors the kind of teaching and community service you represent. Would you be willing to help design something that serves students the way you've been served by this community? It was a genuine offer, free from the patronizing tone that had characterized Blake's previous charitable gestures. We spent the rest of the afternoon discussing possibilities: scholarships for first-generation college students, support for teachers pursuing advanced degrees, funding for community education programs. As the dedication ceremony wound down, Paul and Ellie joined us for a family conversation that felt different from any we'd had in years. Blake was present and engaged rather than distracted and superior. Cassandra contributed ideas instead of just managing Blake's image. For the first time since Margaret's death, we felt like a family working together rather than individuals managing around Blake's success. Dad, Ellie said as we prepared to leave, I'm proud of how you handled this whole situation. You could have been bitter or vindictive, but instead you used it as a teaching opportunity. Blake learned something important, and so did the rest of us. Paul was characteristically direct. Blake, I'm glad you finally figured out that Dad deserves respect, not just financial support, but actions matter more than apologies. Keep being the person you were today, not the person you were last year. That evening, I sat in my study reviewing the day's events and thinking about Margaret's journal entries from years past. She'd written about her concerns that success might change Blake's character, but also about her faith that the values we'd taught him would eventually resurface when tested. Leo raising a prince. She'd written, but princes can forget they serve a kingdom, not themselves. If that happens, someone will need to remind him that crowns are earned through service, not inherited through birth.